Muy buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Hello.
Tardes.
Buenas tardes. I mean, and really, it is going to be, well, 10 after 10.
Dear university authorities, representatives of the United States Embassy, and representatives of the Honduran government in the education ministry. Dear keynote speakers, guest speakers, presenters, special guests, and English teachers in general. On behalf of the organizing committee and on behalf of the language teaching department at Universidad Pedagógica Nacional Francisco Morazán, it is a great honor for me to officially welcome you to the 13th International Conference for Teachers of English, New Perspectives in TEFL in the Post-Pandemic Era. It seems like yesterday that we were opening our 12th conference, and now we are here gathered again to open our 13th conference. It is a great joy and it is a great pleasure to be with you all here. To start with our opening ceremony, we're going to listen to the president of UPNFM, Dr. Hermes Alduvín Díaz, with some opening remarks for the audience.
Muy buenas tardes. Tengan todos, reciban un fraterno saludo y mis deseos de bienestar para cada uno de ustedes. Tengo el honor esta tarde de darles la más cordial de las bienvenidas a esta 13ª Conferencia Internacional para Profesores de Inglés, que desarrollará el tema Nuevas Perspectivas de la Enseñanza del Inglés después de la pandemia. Quiero saludar con mucho entusiasmo a las distinguidas autoridades universitarias, los vicerrectores, decanos, vicedecanos, directores de unidades académicas, jefes de departamento, coordinadores de carrera, directores de centros universitarios a nivel nacional, y saludar además a las autoridades educativas nacionales que son parte de este evento, y darles también todo nuestro aprecio y saludo a nuestros aliados estratégicos nacionales e internacionales, y especialmente a la Embajada de los Estados Unidos, que es un aliado estratégico nuestro. A la apreciada jefa del Departamento de Lenguas, la profesora Luz Gomez, y su equipo de docentes y colaboradores de este evento académico. A los 33 distinguidos conferencistas nacionales e internacionales que nos honrarán con sus participaciones y disertaciones en este evento académico. A nuestros graduados de la carrera de la enseñanza del inglés, que también son el motivo para que estas jornadas de desarrollo profesional se mantengan de forma continua en el tiempo. A nuestros estudiantes y público en general, también un saludo muy especial a los amigos que dirigen los 6 canales de YouTube que retransmitirán este gran evento, y desde luego a todos los especialistas que desde diferentes países del mundo coordinarán las sesiones en vivo, como países como Filipinas, Colombia, México, los Estados Unidos, Vietnam, Nueva Zelanda, Trinidad y Tobago, India, Guatemala, El Salvador, Rusia, Grecia y por supuesto nuestro país. Saludo también a los estimados amigos que nos acompañan a través de las redes sociales que tiene la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional a disposición. Hoy nos reunimos de forma virtual en ocasión para desarrollar esta conferencia que nació hace 24 años y que surgió como una respuesta a la necesidad de brindar capacitación continua a todos nuestros docentes de inglés, y que hoy, en su 13ª edición, ha evolucionado y adaptado sus raíces para enfrentar los retos de la enseñanza del inglés en la era post-pandemia. Recordar además que desde su inicio en el año de 1999, esta conferencia ha sido un faro de conocimiento y desarrollo profesional para los educadores de inglés en Honduras y otros y otras regiones del mundo. Su origen, respaldado por la Embajada de los Estados Unidos, nos ha permitido contar con especialistas de alto nivel, cuyos nombres resuenan en el mundo de la academia en la enseñanza del inglés como lengua extranjera. Este año nos enorgullece contar con la presencia de los doctores Dudley Reynolds y Paul K. Matsuda, dos figuras destacadas en el campo internacional de la enseñanza del inglés como segunda lengua. Agradezco también a ambos su compromiso de compartir el conocimiento y su vasta experiencia en este campo. A lo largo de las 12 ediciones anteriores, esta conferencia ha brindado talleres, plenarias y capacitaciones que buscan actualizar a nuestros docentes en las tendencias actuales de la enseñanza del inglés. Más allá de la teoría, este espacio ha permitido compartir experiencias de aula que enriquecen la labor de cada uno de nuestros graduados. Con la llegada de la pandemia, se expandieron aún más los horizontes y por eso no solo contamos con presentadores internacionales, sino que también hemos establecido una red internacional de universidades que se han unido a nosotros para desarrollar este gran esfuerzo académico. Decirles además que esta conferencia también ha sido posible gracias al copatrocinio de Fulbright, Honduras, Macmillan y la red de ingeniería. Quiero agradecer a todos ellos por su apoyo incondicional para este evento. Finalmente, quiero reconocer el arduo trabajo del comité organizador de esta conferencia, conformado por los profesores Clara Chavez, Tomás Monge, Sally Soto y Tevin Padilla. Así que de esta forma les doy la más cordial de las bienvenidas a cada uno de ustedes. Les agradezco por ser parte de esta jornada de aprendizaje y crecimiento académico. Y espero que disfruten y aprovechen al máximo esta 13ª Conferencia Internacional para Profesores de Inglés. Muchas gracias a todos y feliz tarde.
We thank our president for these remarks and for officially opening our 13th conference. Thank you very much, Dr. Diaz. Now, I have to announce our next speaker, Mr. Skarn Rednine. I hope I pronounced the name well, who is the Cultural Affairs Officer for the U.S. Embassy. He is the Cultural Affairs Officer representative. He has some remarks for us.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Monge, and thank you very much, distinguished Director Diaz, for your welcoming remarks, and to all the others who organized this conference. ¿Inglés o español? Bueno, I think I will do this in English, since this is an English conference. So my name is Skarin Rivnine. I am the new Cultural Affairs Officer at U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa as of the last 3 weeks approximately. So I'm very pleased to see such a fantastic event. Once again, the U.S. Embassy is pleased to contribute to the Universidad Pedagógica Nacional Francisco Morazán's English Teachers Conference, your 13th conference and first for me. So congratulations for consistently organizing these conferences that reach and benefit so many English teachers in Honduras and in the region. This year, the embassy, along with the Regional English Language Office, known as the RELO in Mexico, contributes 2 outstanding presenters through the English Language Specialist Program. The first is Dr. Dudley Reynolds, an international leader in teaching of English to speakers of other languages. And the second, Dr. Paul K. Matsuda, is a researcher and an expert in writing English as a second language. And we also have presenting today Mr. David Fay, who is our Regional English Language Officer based in Mexico City. The embassy also prepared and delivered English teaching materials for students preparing to become teachers of English as a foreign language at Universidad Pedagógica Nacional. And this should benefit hundreds of young school students throughout Honduras. All of these contributions are funded through Department of State, U.S. Department of State initiatives that promote the learning and teaching of American English around the world to increase mutual understanding between the people of the United States and nations of the world, including Honduras. Although the pandemic brought on many challenges, especially in education, as we all know, we did learn to increase virtual connections, and that in many cases extend our reach well beyond what we had ever considered before. We hope that this is also the case with your virtual conference and that you reach participants all over Honduras, Central America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and even beyond. So with that, we wish the organizers much success, and to the participants, much learning to carry it forward to each and every one of your students, because doing so, we literally multiply the impact of this program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ribnine, for your remarks. And we thank the embassy for every time that you sponsor our conferences and you help us develop these type of events. Thank you very much. We have the head of our language teaching department, Ms. Maria Luz Gomez, with some remarks.
Muchas gracias, Tomás. Buenas tardes a todos. Saludamos a todas las autoridades que nos acompañan en esta tarde, a los representantes de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos de América, a todos nuestros presentadores, tanto nacionales como internacionales, a todos los docentes que nos acompañan en esta tarde, a toda la audiencia que se ha unido con nosotros y a todos nuestros estudiantes. El Departamento de la Enseñanza de Lenguas de la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional Francisco Morazán se complace en este día en presentarles a todos ustedes el 13º evento de nuestra Conferencia Internacional para Profesores de Inglés. Es para nosotros una gran satisfacción como departamento el ser parte de una institución formadora de docentes, el poder ofrecer a ustedes una capacitación de este tipo para todos ustedes profesionales en la enseñanza del inglés, tanto a nivel nacional como internacional, tanto del sector público como del sector privado. Esta es una oportunidad que tenemos de capacitarnos continuamente a través de estas conferencias que ofrecemos bienalmente. De igual forma, nos alegra el poder contar con todo este público internacional que se nos une y que se beneficia de igual forma de estas conferencias. El poder compartir, reflexionar y aprender junto con todos estos profesionales que compartirán con nosotros en esta conferencia. Contamos, ya se los mencioné, con presentadores tanto internacionales como nacionales que unidos a nosotros hacen que nuestro evento suba a distancias estratosféricas. Gracias a todos ustedes por estar aquí con nosotros. Y de igual forma les agradecemos a todos los participantes en todas partes del mundo, ya que sabemos que están ávidos de ese conocimiento. Les abrimos las puertas de nuestra casa, la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional Francisco Morazán. Muchas gracias.
We thank the head of our language teaching department for her remarks. Thank you very much, Ms. Gomez. And on behalf of the organizing committee, it's been a long but fun journey trying to gather all these academic rock stars that we have for this 13th conference, because we have several academic rock stars. And it will be an enriching and fulfilling experience these 3 days. We have the president of our English conference, Ms. Clara Chavez, with her welcoming words.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dear colleagues, honored authorities of Universidad Pedagógica Nacional Francisco Morazán, respected sponsor from the United States Embassy in Tegucigalpa, members of the conference committee, and all those joining us from different corners of our nation and beyond. A warm welcome to each and every one of you. It is with great pleasure that I stand before you on behalf of Universidad Pedagógica Nacional Francisco Morazán, extending a heartfelt greeting. Today marks a significant moment as we inaugurate the much anticipated 13th International Conference for Teachers of English under the theme New Perspective in TEFL in the Post-Pandemic Era. As we virtually gather, we embark on a collective journey as educators with the goal of enhancing our teaching practice. The main purpose of this event is to provide training to teachers of English in Honduras and beyond, share results of recent research done in the ELT field, and learn lessons that hopefully can be replicated in our classrooms. There is no denying that the English language teaching field has been irrevocably transformed by the pandemic wave. And navigating the complexities of remote teaching, overcoming obstacles, and learning lessons from these experiences have all contributed to a profound shift in our approach in the classroom. Today, we gather as a community of practice to learn and offer innovative perspectives and methodologies that have proven to be successful in our practice so that we can align with our evolved education field. The Language Teaching Department, in collaboration with a dedicated organizing committee, has worked hard to provide this enriching experience for participants. I'm confident you will fully immerse yourself in the journey. Welcome once again to this 13th International Conference for Teachers of English. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Chavez, for your welcoming words. Now, the conference is officially open, and without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Gloria Ulloa, who is going to introduce our first keynote speaker for his plenary session.
This is very, very exciting. Our 13th conference for teachers of English. We still remember our first conference like in 1999, and now we are in 2023, and we have these rock stars. I want to welcome our university authorities, the USA Embassy Cultural Affairs Officer, and the representatives, guest specialists, Ministry of Education representatives, and our teachers of English. This conference is for you. We're so happy to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Dudley Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds is the Senior Associate Dean for the Education and Teaching Professor of English at Carnegie Mellon University, Qatar. He served as president of TESOL International Association in 2016 to 2017, and has been a teacher and researcher of multilingual language learners for over 35 years, working primarily with learners of English. His research addresses language education policy, developmental patterns in additional language learning, curricular and pedagogical approaches to literacy development, teacher education and learning. Recent publications include Handbook of Multilingual TESOL in Practice and Policy Development in TESOL and Multilingualism, Past, Present, and the Way Forward, co-edited with Kashif Reza and Christine Comby. He is the 2023 recipient of TESOL International Association James F. Alatis Award for Service to TESOL. It is a great honor to have Dr. Reynolds with us this afternoon. It is a wonderful honor to have introduced someone I had the honor to meet at the International TESOL Summit. The floor is yours. We're eager to learn from you, Dr. Reynolds. Welcome to our conference.
Wow, that's a hard introduction to follow, but thank you so much, Gloria. Senor Diaz, Senora Gomez, Clara, Tomas, all of you. Let me just begin by saying how much and how impressed I've been with the organization for this conference, and in particular, the way in which you have worked to make this conference available to teachers and interested people around the world through your use of social media and not just the Zoom. I think it's really remarkable, the efforts that you've made, and I want to compliment you all. Let me also begin by thanking the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Department of State, which has sponsored my participation in the conference and made it possible. And I'm very grateful for that. And let me get a little set up here now and make sure that I am able, David, I think you're going to need to enable so that I can share my screen and slides, if that's possible.
Not a problem. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second, Dr. Brenes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is the fun part of a virtual conference, is always that little transition till we get the slides set up and running. But the nice part about this is that I think we've all done this enough now that we're very used to it. And we know what happens when we've got a virtual conference here. So hopefully you can now see my slides. Tomas, I see your face, so if you'll just shake your head and tell me that you see the slide, the opening slide, perfect. So my title today is TEFL, ChatGPT, and Multilingualism, the imperative for new perspectives in the post-pandemic era. And I think it's important to always begin, especially if you're the opening keynote, by thinking a little bit about what the conference theme is and maybe why the organizers chose this as their theme. So our conference theme for the next 3 days is New Perspectives in TEFL in the post-pandemic era, and the questions it raises for us to be thinking about. Clearly, the focus of this theme is on perspectives in TEFL, but what we're really being asked to think about is how perspectives are new and different in the post-pandemic era. That's kind of a heavy phrase there, post-pandemic era, especially when we realize that the pandemic really officially only ended 3 months ago in May, right? So maybe what we should really say is we're being asked to make sense of our present moment, to reflect on and discover how our perspectives today have changed and are changing. What's going on right now with respect to key ideas in our field? Okay. So, given this imperative, let's go back and think for a moment about what we mean by perspectives in TEFL. First of all, TEFL is what unites us. It is the activity that we share, whether we are teaching in San Pedro Sula or Dohakata, whether we're in a classroom with 9-year-olds every day, or we write textbooks for a publishing company. TEFL is what defines us. It is the parameters of our field, and it brings us together. Perspectives, on the other hand, literally means a drawing technique for representing a 3-dimensional object on a flat surface. And it's a technique that gives us an impression that we're seeing something from a particular position, right? It gives us directionality. Now, the conference theme uses that term metaphorically to refer to how we represent ideas in and about our field of TEFL. So, for example, what is the central knowledge of our field? We have a perspective that allows us to answer that question. What is key knowledge for the students in our classrooms to develop? We have perspectives on that. What should we do in classrooms if we're teaching something called English to students who already know other languages? Maybe, and perhaps one of the most central questions for our field is even, what is English? What do we mean by that word? There are lots of questions that we could try and answer. But the one that I think is an imperative for today is to consider how recent advances in technology, and in particular, something that we're now hearing referred to as generative AI. Many of us know it by the other term, which is ChatGPT, which is really a tool or a type of generative AI. How is this advance in technology shaping our perspectives in TEFL? And more specifically, sorry about that, the perspectives we adopt on what we teach. Okay? So, what do I mean by perspectives on what we teach? Maybe if somebody asks you, so what is it you do every day? You say, well, I teach English. And by that, you mean I teach a language that is distinct from Spanish, it's distinct from Mosquito, it's distinct from Chorti, whatever it is, right? But you think of it as I'm teaching a language that's distinct from other languages. And that's how you explain what you do. One of the earliest ways in which our field answered this question was that we thought of in terms of structures, and in a sense, structures that are hierarchically organized. So we thought about, or we thought that, what we're teaching is grammatical patterns that are combined with vocabulary, which can then be combined to create higher level structures like sentences, conversational turns. Sentences, conversational turns are structures which can then be combined to create even higher level structures or units. Things like essays or asking for directions, right? At some point, our field began to focus much more on the notion of language as communication. We began to conceptualize language as skills that operate at the intersection of an interactional role, meaning either we are receivers of language or we are producing language, and a modality for the code, in a sense, whether it's written or oral. And that's where we came up with this sort of four, if you think about it, right? The four key skills: reading, writing, listening, speaking. More recently, people have begun to focus on teaching students to do things with language, right? To complete tasks. So something like creating a tourism brochure. And in the process of working on that task, we work on their production fluency, the accuracy of the structures involved, and the structural complexity, right? So these are perspectives or examples of perspectives on what we teach in TEFL. Now, you'll notice that in the illustrations on the slide, I've sort of tried to show that each of these ways of answering this question, in a sense, also visualizes an answer to the question, right? So I don't just have a lot of bullets on this slide. I've tried to actually represent what I'm talking about visually in a different way, to show that each of these sort of ways of thinking about the question, right? Whether it's distinct spheres, a memorizable list, a decision matrix, a unit of human activity that can vary in multiple ways. That this perspective that we take on what we teach, this visualizing model, is important because it becomes the basis for how we make decisions about, for example, what resources to draw on for class material. Because if we visualize and we think of English as a distinct sphere from other languages, it's much more likely that we won't see the relevance of those other languages for teaching English. Teaching English is something that is separate and apart, right? And so we just teach in English and we ignore the other languages in the classroom. If we think of it as the sort of maybe the basis, or if we're trying to think, what should the sequence of instruction be? Well, if we look at this intersection of receptive and productive roles with modes of language, we think, okay, wait a minute. Receptive is something which is more passive. It's therefore easier than productive language. So we probably should start by simply asking our students to hear language, read language, before we focus too much on production. Another important question that we have to answer is, how are we going to assess development? And if we're focused on this sort of holistic unit of activity, like creating a tourism brochure, well, if it's holistic, then we're going to say, well, if we're going to do that well, we've got to be fluent, accurate, and appropriately complex, right? That all of these go together in a sense. And that's going to influence how we assess. All right. So this is probably something that's not very new to many of you on this talk today, right? I'm going over things that you've seen before. You maybe haven't quite thought about them in the way I'm talking about them, but this is core content that gets covered in courses on pedagogy in our field. But if we're going to think forward, what I want to propose to you today is that we need to think about how these mental models are changing in what we're now referring to as the post-pandemic era. What's going on right now that's going to make us change and adapt these models? Before we can talk about the post-pandemic era, though, we probably should talk about the pandemic era, right? Let's think backwards just a little bit. And what was happening in language classrooms during the pandemic? For me, one of the biggest lessons was simply realizing how fast life can change, right? And I want you to kind of remember that a second, bookmark it, and I'm going to come back to it when we're talking about the post-pandemic era. I grabbed this screenshot from the website of a US school district during the pandemic. And when I was preparing this talk, I went back and found it and dug it out of a talk I'd given during the pandemic when I used it. And I looked at it and I'm saying, wow. Okay, so this is a school district in charge of lots of schools. And look what the pictures are showing. Nothing that looks like what I have always thought of as a school, right? And certainly not what I had thought of as school just a few months before this screenshot was taken. There are no classrooms, per se, in the school district's photos. There are no pictures of teachers. There are no playgrounds. There are no school buses. There's nothing that is sort of what I think of typical of school. But at the same time, when I look at it, I say, yes, clearly this is about education, right? These are pictures of children learning. But they're learning because of technology, right? They would not have been learning, in a sense, without technology. Because we needed to be distant from each other, the normal everyday communication between teachers and students and between students and students that happens all the time as part of education. During the pandemic, that communication was happening by technology, and it was happening on an unprecedented scale. This extreme disruption of normal, in turn, forced us to think about consciously what could be accomplished through technology, how technology mediates and shapes communication, and in turn, education. We learned about all sorts of tools that allowed us to teach live classes and attend professional conferences like this one over the internet. I'll admit, I never participated in a virtual conference before the pandemic. We learned things like, how do you develop an online module that supports flipped classrooms? How do you assess group work through a Google Doc? How do you allow students to discuss their opinions of a reading via WhatsApp? We also became much more aware of how communication and in turn education can be both synchronous and asynchronous, and that each mode has advantages and disadvantages. We became even more aware that communication is often multimodal and that multimodality, in fact, supports education. Think for a moment about how Zoom now allows for closed captioning, so you can read as well as hear at the same time. Think about what you see in a WhatsApp group chat, right? That has people typing in messages. Some people are recording voice memos. Others are just using emojis, and some are uploading a photo or a meme in order to communicate, right? My favorite sort of question that is one I'd never thought about, right? I love dialogue. I love question and answer, right? During the pandemic, I was faced with this question, okay, can I speak? Can I just raise my hand, or can I just interrupt the speaker? Or is this the kind of question that I should put in chat? In other words, is it a question I write, or is it a question that can be answered later? Or is it a question I have to ask right now? These are questions we hadn't really been thinking about before. And what I'm trying to say is that we were thinking about them because of the technology, right? We were trying to answer new questions about how to, in a sense, do the business of education. How does education work? The technology was really kind of pushing us in all sorts of new directions, opening up new possibilities. Something else, though, was going on during this time. And during all of this technologically mediated education that perhaps we were a little bit less aware of. During the pandemic, we saw more and more mundane uses of everyday language being preserved digitally on an unprecedented scale as posts on social media, transcripts of video conversations, etc. Not only were they being preserved, but most of us didn't or think much about the fact that when we agreed to use WhatsApp or whatever it was, we were also agreeing to let technology companies have access to those samples of language that we were creating for their research purposes, right? We were, in a sense, freely giving our language to Google, Microsoft, and Meta. With this as background, let's finally get to the post-pandemic era, right? And I mean, the irony is I'm talking about it as if it sounds like a generation, and yet it's probably 3 months after the last period, right? That's where we're at right now. Look at today's headlines. It wasn't hard for me to find these screenshots, right? And you've all seen screenshots and you've read articles with headlines just like this. What's catching our attention today? I think I see two themes across this kind of article. The first is the speed with which change is happening. The second is the role of technology as a disruptor of education, right? The interesting difference here from the ways in which the pandemic stretched our thinking about language and communication, however, is that the technology is no longer a mediator of communication. It's a communicator, or at least it seems to be. The companies that have been storing our text on internet pages, archiving our social media posts, making transcripts of our Zoom calls, and otherwise serving freely as mediators of communication for a long time now, have been feeding all of this digitized language into computers that were developing their own perspectives on language, right? They were constructing structural models, figuring out which patterns were common and uncommon, and to some extent also estimating even values that we attach to different things that we read and hear, right? What needed to be corrected, what didn't need to be corrected, what evoked surprise, what evoked positive responses, negative responses. All of this, in a sense, was being analyzed and learned from. This is startling and it is scary to many of us. I freely admit, I'm kind of like looking at this and thinking, I never even imagined that what is possible is possible. But it is what it is. And it raises all sorts of interesting questions. Most importantly, if students, and here one of the headlines, and I thought I had grabbed it in one of these screenshots, and I came back and I realized I hadn't found it. But the headline was, students are using ChatGPT to do their homework. Well, if that's what's going on, whether we like it or not, I think we need to be thinking about how this will and should change what we teach in our TEFL classrooms. Okay, I spent about, looks like 25 minutes so far at a very kind of high and theoretical level. And I want to now say, sort of transition, and let's focus on an example. You know, what is he talking about when he mentions ChatGPT? And so I'm going to give you an example of me interacting with this tool. And I would encourage you, as we look at this example, to think about whether, in fact, the tool is communicating with me. Is it a communicator? Now, Also, as we look at this example, please keep in mind that while I think I speak, and to a lesser extent write Spanish fairly well, I am a learner of Spanish, right? And you'll see that I put some Spanish here in the chat, in my chat, because I wanted to, in a sense, demonstrate what might happen when a learner of a language uses this tool. Okay. And by the way, I'm a university teacher. My students are university students, but I would encourage you not to think that this is a problem that university teachers need to be thinking about, right? And the reason I'd say that is if you're teaching first grade and your students know how to use Google to find a picture or search for something, I'm pretty certain that they're going to be using ChatGPT in the first grade very soon. All right. So I think that this is an issue that impacts all of us wherever we work within the field. So, as I said earlier, ChatGPT is a generative AI tool. It's been trained on what's called a large language model, an LLM. And what it's learned from that model is how to predict with a fairly high likelihood of being acceptable a response to a question. So that question is what is technically known as a prompt. This sequence of prompts and responses is the chat. The GPT part refers to generative pre-trained transformers, which is a reference to the particular kind of algorithm that the tool uses to produce its part of the chat. Now, let's looking at this example, you will see that I have a penchant for existential questions. And so my prompt started out just trying to figure out whether the tool was going to be able to respond to me in Spanish, because I'd only previously used it in English and I wasn't quite sure what it could do in a language other than English. I was naive, all right? Probably, though, what's more interesting in just this little pair right here, this little exchange, if we think about us as our role as language teachers, is the way that ChatGPT gave me implicit corrective feedback, right? Without even being asked to. You'll notice, if you look carefully, that my spelling of comunicar wasn't very good, right? I was too influenced by English and doubled the M. I also left the reflexive pronoun off. I said, puedes comunicar, not puedes comunicarte conmigo, right? But when ChatGPT answered, it subtly just corrected those things. It also switched to standard Spanish punctuation marks, so I would have visual and reinforcement of what I should have done when asking a question. And it very nicely offered to help me with cualquier duda que tengo. Okay? Very nice and accommodating. Since it wanted to help me, I decided to take it up on its offer. So I responded by letting it know what my homework assignment was. And like a good lazy student, I did it in English, right? Like a good language teacher, ChatGPT continued in the language we had started in, Spanish, right? It's trying to keep me practicing, in a sense. It also sort of responded in an interesting way, which was to suggest things that I could do myself in order to write a bio statement. It suggested categories of information that would be appropriate for what I said I needed, which was a bio statement. It's kind of like it gave me a writing prompt, right? That was nice of it. But again, I'm a good student and I want to see how much work I can get the tool to do for me. And so I told it, okay, all right, no, I want you to write, in a sense, I want you to write the bio statement for me. Here's my name. You can find out things about me if you just Google, right? Carnegie Mellon University in Qatar. ChatGPT apologized. Very nice of it. And reminded me that I was talking to a machine. And perhaps more importantly, a machine that was really a model of language, right? So it's telling me, wait a minute, there's something in a sense artificial in my response to you. No, by the way, however, it has given up speaking Spanish to me. Okay. And it told me what it could do there. So it said it could generate a general biographic statement, which it did, using the little bit of information that I'd given it, which was my name and where I worked. But look at how it did the general biographic statement. Right? It's, in a sense, it created a template, if you will, right? So it started out, mi nombre es Dudley Reynolds, y trabajo en la Universidad Carnegie Mellon in Qatar. So okay, describe your job. Fill in the blank here, right? See, it's bracketed it. En esa prestigiosa institución educativa. That was very nice that it called it prestigious, right? My areas of interest and experience include, and then again, it doesn't know the answer, so it says, put something here, right? A lo largo de mi carrera, that it knows that I've had a long career. I don't know how, but it says that, right? I have worked hard to contribute to the field of, all right, name your field. It's a very interesting response because, you know what? It reminds me exactly of some exercises that I remember from the very first writing textbook that I used 35 years ago with low-level students. It's what it looks like, right? Because we would sort of give them a frame of, here's something, and it was a way of introducing them to a genre. It was a way of building both basic vocabulary, but also sort of frame sentences, right? That then the students could individualize. ChatGPT is really, really trying to teach me something here. And that's the way it's working, in a sense. So what can we learn from this? How is the ability of a machine to do what I've just showed you going to change the way we teach our classes and what we teach in them? Now, in this slide, I've replaced ChatGPT with the more technical term, generative AI. And I did that because ChatGPT is just one of many tools that are appearing and which are capable of responding to and generating novel written text, like you just saw, generating novel images, generating even novel audio, all right? Now, the technology is not perfect, and there are lots, there's lots out there that you can read about the imperfections in what it produces. The technical term for the imperfections I learned as I'm reading up on this is hallucinations, by the way, all right? So a hallucination is when it produces something that looks and seems to be the right answer or authentic or whatever, but in fact is totally made up. So this is a problem. Additionally, these tools tend to reinforce stereotypes, right? Remember, they've learned things like values from the language that they've trained on. And if there are stereotypes in that language, then they're likely to reproduce them. This may be anything from the association of a gender with particular roles to what's important, what's not important in a society. Additionally, we have to recognize that these tools, in a sense, if they become so prevalent, are going to pose an existential threat to languages that don't have lots of digital samples for the technology to learn from, right? So it's great in Spanish. How is it in Mosquito? I doubt it can, right? I don't know that, but I doubt. So there are lots of problems with this technology, but we can't ignore it. And as the title of my talk suggested, I think we've got an imperative to think about this. So, how is it going to change the classes? First, when we put on our pedagogical hats for a moment, I think we're going to see a need for a new type of assignment. Historically, we've used, if you think about it, final products usually to assess language and communicative development. We've graded the final draft of the essay. We've asked students to give a presentation in class or act something out, whatever it is. We've focused, in a sense, on the end stage of production. Our problem is that generative AI can now produce those products. It can do the homework. And so just as math teachers had to put much greater emphasis on showing your work once calculators were introduced, we're going to need to come up with more assignments that, in a sense, open up production so that we can see the thought processes behind, okay, the product. Secondly, we have to think about our students using these tools. And we have to remember that our students are almost always what are technically known as unequal bilinguals. That is, they have a lot of linguistic resources in the language usually that they were introduced to first. They have a lot less resources in the language that they're learning, right? Because generative AI easily responds to prompts in a multitude of languages, students are much more, maybe or probably will be, asking it to do things in a language. First of all, they're going to use the language where they have a lot of proficiency, and they're going to ask it to produce something in the language where they have less proficiency, right? But what the tool is going to produce is something which may be very developed, very complex. In other words, it's going to be something which may be beyond the level of what they could have themselves produced. And so we're going to have to teach them to be very careful about just using whatever the tool gives you. Because what if you don't really understand what you're turning in? We're going to have to, in a sense, teach them to be cautious about claiming ownership, all right? In fact, in my university first year writing class this time, for the first time, I'm talking a lot with my students this semester about what does it mean when you call yourself an author? What does it mean to own a text? So I'm not talking about writing a text. I'm talking about owning what you write. All right. And what does that mean there? I think that this teaching students how to evaluate a language product, how to be critical, is going to become increasingly important. So, how do we do these two things? First, let's think about assignments that open the process that is used to produce language, right? I said we're going to have to move from evaluating final products to assignments that get at how we got to that final product. The nice thing is that because generative AI tools are interactive, they create a record of the back and forth between you and them, right? This is the chat of ChatGPT. Prompt response, right? They record, in a sense, a conversation. And I think that there is a lot of potential in these chats as a new form of assignment, as a record of, in a sense, how the student got to a product that was better than what they started with. And so in other words, I'm saying have your students submit a transcript of them working with ChatGPT, all right? Maybe we could also ask them, think about what you could do with that transcript, right? You could add annotations to it where the student maybe explains why they asked this prompt. Or maybe you could have them divide the transcript into stages and come up with a label. Here I was working on just generating enough ideas to fully explore the topic. Here I was thinking about how I might sequence my ideas, all right? By this point, I had something that I felt pretty good about, but I realized that the language was either too simplistic or too complex, right? So we were working on getting the language structures right at this point. We could even, so that's one way, right? And that's pretty much all of the responsibility on the student to think about what to ask. But we could also tell them what to ask, right? We could, for example, say, I want you to work with ChatGPT, and I want you to start by inputting some data, because it can't, as I discovered, it can't go find data on the internet for you. So you find the data on the internet. Maybe, why don't you see if you can find somewhere that there are a lot of bio statements and copy those bio statements. I had fun. I went to a conference website, and because conference websites, like the one for this, they publish the bio statements that the presenters provide, right? Oh, good. I've got a corpus right there. Copy those, right? Have ChatGPT analyze all the bio statements submitted for a conference. And then ask ChatGPT, what are the characteristics of an English teacher's conference bio statement? It'll do it. It's very interesting to see what it comes up with, right? Then you might say, or pose to ChatGPT, if this were to change, maybe it's a math conference, how might the bio statement change? So you can always think of a permutation, right? Now, a couple of things to note here. Yes, I am suggesting that we get the tool to write the bio statement, the final one, right? But I don't think the student's being passive here. They have to ask questions, right? they're thinking a lot about this in order simply to even know what to ask the tool. Additionally, especially if you're having them go out and collect research, right? Find samples to input as models, they're doing something. And secondly, as they're doing it, what's happening and being recorded in the chat is a process. We often historically have emphasized, or we think of language competency in terms of automaticity, in terms of fluency in language production. But how do we get learners to that point? Yes, we want them to be fluent. We want them to have automaticity. Well, the best way to get them there is to unpack production, right? To open it up as a process, to think about stages, how a change at one point in that process leads to a totally different product. Okay? These are the kinds of things that I think we can do with this assignment. And this is why I think it's worthwhile for students. Now, the second thing that I suggested is for TEFL classrooms is that we need to teach students to be good evaluators of language, to teach criticality. One of the things that we see in a chat with a tool is that frequently, as I've already suggested, right? You start with one prompt, you get something, don't quite like it, and so you revise the prompt and ChatGPT gives you yet another answer, right? Or you also you don't even have to revise the prompt. There actually is a little button at the end when it gives you an answer that says regenerate, which means if you don't like the answer I gave you the first time, I'll give you a second answer, and I'll give you a third answer, right? So ChatGPT will easily produce multiple different responses to a single prompt, or, right? Or to different prompts there. And then regardless of whether the texts were created as a response to a changing prompt or the same prompt, once we have those multiple texts, we can use them as the basis for a discussion. The texts can be compared to each other, right? They can also be compared to texts that are not machine generated, that the students themselves have written. It could be a text that the student wrote in the target language. It could be a text that the student wrote in their strong language and then fed through a translator, all right? What you see, there are lots of possibilities. And in fact, what you see on the right side of this slide is the bio statement that Gloria shared with you when she introduced me. It has now been translated into Spanish by Google Translate, all right? And on the left side of the slide is that generic bio statement that ChatGPT created or generated when I said, I need a bio statement, help, right? Okay, so think about just these two texts. What could you do as a language teacher with them? What questions would you ask, all right? One idea I came up with is, okay, clearly the one on the right has actual information in it. The one on the left has fill in the blank. Could students search the one on the right to find the information that goes in the blanks? Maybe. All right. There. They might also look at some of the framing language. The ChatGPT template on the left begins, mi nombre es. My bio statement, right, that was fed through Google Translate begins Dudley Reynolds as. It's an interesting just difference to pose to the students. Say, why is that? What do you think the impact of that is? What's the influence of whether we use first person or third person? in a bio statement. You might also ask them which one's easier to read. I actually think probably the ChatGPT one is written in a way that's easier to read. Okay, what about it makes it easier? We've always used examples as a teaching tool, right? I'm not proposing anything new. But first of all, what I'm talking about is matched examples, paired examples, multiple examples, and asking students to think about what they can figure out by looking at these multiple examples, right? Is that comparison there? So if we think about it as noticing similarities and differences, right? Speculating about the reasons for differences, how we might provide evidence for our reasons. Okay, so you're saying that this one's easier. Why? Pull something that you believe is easier. Find something to compare. And constantly be asking to make judgments about effectiveness. Okay? One suggestion I've seen in multiple places is get your students to take the rubric that you use for evaluating their work and have them apply it to a sample generated by ChatGPT. In other words, get them to practice using a rubric on a sample of language. Okay. So I've given you some examples of what ChatGPT is. I've tried to suggest some things that you might do with it. And that sounds almost like a pretty good place to stop. But if you have a really good memory, you remember that the title of my talk today is TEFL, ChatGPT, and Multilingualism. Why did I put multilingualism in that title? It's because I want to put a plug in. I want to encourage you to do exactly what I've shown you in the examples that I've created today, which is don't be afraid to create exercises where students are in fact going back and forth between languages. Languages that they know well and languages that they are learning. Because the odds are they're going to be doing that anyway if they're interacting with this tool, right? They're going to be asking something in Spanish. They're going to be asking other things in English. They're going to be getting some responses in Spanish. It's a very multilingual, right? Or it's an environment that supports multilingual interaction easily. Okay? And so if we're teaching them how to use those tools effectively, that needs to be part of the equation. They need to be developing the skills and awareness that competent multilinguals possess. This is something I've been advocating for several years in my own research under the term of multilingual TESOL. It's a way of teaching English to multilingual students that encourages them to use all of their linguistic and metalinguistic resources to figure out how to communicate in English, all right? And I think we do a disservice if we keep the English classroom to be only English, all right? Maybe there are times when we want to say we need to do this particular thing only in English. But I don't think we should totally exclude the other languages that students know, right? And why is that, right? Is that because I think it allows for greater emphasis on the processes and products, okay, of language production, as well as more work on criticality. Think for a moment about production processes, all right? So for example, one way of describing the production of a language is we identify a topic, we identify a communicated purpose, we analyze the context, we identify standard categories of information that we need to convey. if you think about that sequence, does that only happen in English? No. It happens across languages, right? This is knowledge that is relevant, or this is what happens in language, not just in English, right? And so I think it's well worth asking students to think about their process in a language where it's a fluent process. There, right? That's also gets at this notion of product. But when we begin to talk about what makes the final product an effective product, that is a very contextualized judgment, right? It is a language-specific judgment, right? So in other words, when something is an English text, we typically assume that it is going to be read by people who are highly proficient in English or have the competency to understand it in English, right? But this may be where actually having some comparative texts in students' first languages, primary languages, becomes useful. Figuring out that what works in their primary language doesn't necessarily work in the new language. Most of us, when we learned language teaching methodology, actually learned about this, but we learned of it as bad because we learned of it as something called contrastive analysis. Contrastive analysis was bad because it was primarily used to eradicate grammatical error, right? I think there's a role for contrastive analysis if our goal is to teach criticality. It's teaching evaluation. And so we're not just looking at two texts, we're looking at texts in context, right? We're looking at how texts are received and what works here but doesn't work there, for example. So this is the kind of thing that I'm advocating and why I believe we should be bringing multilingualism into our English classrooms. So in closing, and this is my final slide, and I hope to open it up for some questions after this. I am not advocating that we forget the perspectives that have guided us through many eras in TEFL. I am encouraging us, however, to first of all, focus on language more than languages, realize that tools like ChatGPT make it even easier to fluidly go back and forth between languages using all the resources that we know. Secondly, regardless of the model for language that guides your classroom, emphasize the processes that get us to final products. Whether it be how things are assembled, how is different receiving from producing? What do we do when we receive, right? Work with your students to make communication, if you will, an open book, not just something that is automated. And finally, involve criticality and evaluation of language in everything. So with that, I'm going to close. Gloria, I don't know if you've had a chance to monitor the chat. It looks like there are more chats now than when I started. Mm-hmm. Hopefully some questions there, and maybe you can kind of feed them to me.
Yes, can I do that now?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much for such a great talk. I will give you a couple of minutes because we're running out of time before the next session begins. We have one here from Miguel Paz. Mr. Miguel Paz says, very interesting point regarding artificial intelligence issues. Would you agree that such productive tasks should be done in class rather than as assignments? And he continues, or that the assignments could be divided in chunks, which could be revised in class?
Yes, this is it's a really important question. Is if ChatGPT can do what we used to assign as a homework, what do we now assign as homework and what do we do in class? All right. I don't think it serves students well to simply have them do all their writing in class. First of all, there are students who do not write well or function well under time constraints, all right? And so when we bring all production into the classroom, this is not really fair to that kind of student who has that issue. I believe strongly, I think it's much more important to talk with students about why they need to, in a sense, build the foundation skills, right? One of the best points I've read is, we all use calculators to do math for us fast today, but schools also still teach addition and subtraction, right? And I think we should tell our students that and point out why is that, all right? The reason I'm glad I can add and subtract in my mind is because then I know when I type the wrong number into a calculator, I recognize when something is way off, all right? But so I don't, I think your suggestion of sort of, again, opening up the process, thinking about it as stages, having them do some things at home, maybe like find a bunch of text that you can put into ChatGPT for it to analyze. Do that at home, all right? Then we'll do it together in class and see what it comes up with, and we'll talk about what it says are characteristics of conference bio students, okay? Next question.
We have a comment. It says, Cindy Amador, as a matter of fact, in my school district in Georgia, we're no longer using EL as English learners. We're using ML as multilingual learners. This is just a comment. And she also at the very beginning, she says that it is scary to see kids lacking social skills because they're so into technology. So advantages and disadvantages.
So we just talked about having a discussion in class, right? About a sample of language produced by ChatGPT. What if we're doing that discussion in group work, right? Group work is a way in which students learn social skills. They learn to negotiate with each other. They learn how to make sure everyone gets heard. They learn things like, I'll do this, you do that, all right? They can even learn how to sort of deal with conflict, when it arises in a group. So I think there are lots of ways in which it's not either or, right? It's not using technology or social skills, but rather thinking about how we bring them together, right? The bottom line question is, what is it that we as humans add to what the technology can generate, right? And I'm talking about that question every day with my students. So what is it you add to this? What can you add? Okay.
Well, thank you very much. With this, we close your presentation. We have enjoyed learning about ChatGPT and new technology that we kind of like adopted and adapted while we were in confinement that we have to bring to the new area post-pandemic. Thank you very, very much. We have enjoyed your presentation, and we look forward also to see you again in future presentations during this conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. Thank you, Dr. Ulloa. This has been such a pleasant and enriching plenary. Now we are going to move on to session 1. Just a quick reminder to all the audience, we have a SWAY website and we have a Facebook page. Try to get into the SWAY and look for session 1 on Thursday, 2:30 p.m. And you can click on the presenter's name if you want to connect to the YouTube channel that's going to broadcast live each of the presentations. So you just have to click on the name in there. And once the presentation is live, you will be able to see it. So see you in the next sessions. See you Zoom. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.